The next section is going to cover common utilitarian commands. So the first ones we're going to talk about are going to be the relative, polar, and absolute commands in relation to drawing lines and coordinate systems in general. So if you have been experimenting with drawing polylines, you may find it a bit cumbersome to need to know the exact x, y, or absolute location of where you want that next vertex to occur. Sometimes you may not have that information readily available, but instead a bearing and length such as those you may receive in an email about a property boundary traverse. So, for example, you may have some point somewhere, maybe it is a light post, or maybe it's at the end of a property boundary, or the vertex of a property boundary, and you don't really know what the xy coordinate of that boundary is, or that point is. And you have some boundary line that projects from that point that is, for example, in this case 115 feet long, and it's at an angle or at a bearing of north 60 degrees, 30 minutes, 0 seconds east. And sometimes you may have a directional arrow that looks like this, indicating which way the surveyor surveyed this line. So there's our surveyor, and what he's going to be doing is setting up his equipment so that it's pointing north, and east is going to be to his right, so he's going to be turning his equipment so that he's pointing north. And then once he's got his equipment configured so that it's looking north, he's going to turn it to the right 60.5 degrees, so that's where the bearing comes from. And then usually there's another guy standing there on the other end that has a rod or some other device to make sure that he's shooting at 115 feet. In the old days we had to use kind of like metal tape to measure that. It got to be really cumbersome. But today we have all this great digital technology. So once he's done shooting at that end, sometimes he may move to that end. So the directional arrow tells us that he's going from left to right here, so he's going to move to that end. So again, for example, if we have another line that is shooting maybe southeast, so this one's in the southeast direction. We don't really know what the degrees, minutes, or seconds are in this example, so right now we're just going to be concerned that it's just shooting southeast. And he's moving in this direction, so he's going in a southeast direction towards his next point. So of course he's going to be looking south again, since our bearing is now south. So there's south, and then east is still to his right. Well, I guess it would be to his left since he's looking south, but to our right. And then from now that his equipment is looking south, he's going to turn it towards his left, or I guess our right if we're looking at the screen, towards that line there. So that's the southeast bearing. So as you can imagine, if we were using an absolute coordinate system within Civil 3D, this can be quite painful to kind of draft out, because you'll need to use some trigonometry to figure out the opposite and adjacent lengths to these right triangles. So if we're looking at the first point east and the second point south, that's basically a right triangle, and we would need to calculate out the latitude and the longitude of that north 60 degrees, 30 minute, 0 second east bearing. And of course, you know, that can make drafting something like this quite painful, and you'll probably wonder, why do we even bother using bearings? That's just something that surveyors use and something that we just have to learn to adapt to. And luckily, Civil 3D will allow us to adjust to or change our angle settings within the unit's drawing utilities. So what we would like to do now is figure out how to specify a point, tell Civil 3D the length to the next point, and at what angle from the starting point. So let us first take a look at our drawing settings, because recall 0 degrees is north for this particular example. So I'm just going to ignore all of this stuff here. I'm just going to hit escape. Maybe I'll select all this and choose delete. And I'll go up here to my drawing, my application drop down. I'm going to go to my drawing utilities, and then I'm interested in units. And the thing in here that I'm interested in is this setting right here where it says angle. And if I click this drop down, I have several options here. You can certainly click on each one and then go down here where it says direction to give you a hint of how that will affect the way that you input information. So for this particular example, since we're working with survey data, I'm going to choose the surveyor's units. Now if I go down here to direction, I can see that this is exactly what I want. I need to be able to type in a bearing, but I notice here that my precision is to the degrees and it ignores minutes and seconds. So here, this is where I can change the precision to get more detailed. So here I have degrees, and I think the one that I want is this one here, because I get a decimal for the seconds. In case I have a decimal, usually your decimal is going to be in the seconds. And then over here where it says type, I'm going to make sure that it says decimal. 4 places is fine. Source in units feet. So from here I'll go ahead and click OK. So in our example, we want to draw a line that is 150 feet long, that is running north 60 degrees, 30 minutes, and 0 seconds east. So the next step is we need to determine which one of our coordinate systems we wish to use. So our options are absolute polar, relative polar, and absolute. So obviously we're not going to use absolute because we need to know the exact XY values of each of the points, and we don't have that information because we're starting from some point somewhere in space. Now of course we can always derive that information by finding the latitude and longitude information of that bearing, which we're not going to do. So we're just going to do absolute polar first. We're going to try that command, and then we're going to try relative polar afterwards. So in this example, I'm going to use relative polar, and I'm going to start by clicking on the polyline command. And of course I need to start from some point, so it could be the first point, or maybe I have something like this and I'm starting from this point here. So I don't need to know the exact XY value of this. The only thing I need to know is the length of this next line and the angle. So we've already set our units, so our angles should be good to go. So from here, this is where I type the @ symbol, and then I type in 115 for 115 feet, and then the less than symbol, and then from here I type north, and I'm going to type in 60 degrees, 30 minutes, and 00 seconds, and this is running east, and then I'll press enter, and then I'll hit escape to end this command, and I'm going to just put my cursor down here as if I'm a surveyor, and I can see that that is pretty close to being 60 degrees from the north, going northeast direction, turning northeast. So that is relative polar coordinates. So the command involves the @ symbol and the less than symbol.